This is Let's Talk Education Research, a research podcast from the Institute of Education at Dublin City University, with me, your host, Dr. Peter Tiernan. Hi everybody, I'm here this month with Dr. Neil Kenny from the School of Inclusive and Special Education at the Institute of Education in Dublin City University. So thanks very much for joining me, Neil. I really appreciate you giving up your time and joining us on the podcast. Looking forward to our conversation together.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
No problem at all. So as we always do, can we just start maybe by you telling us a little bit about yourself, introducing yourself?
I'll do my best. Yeah. My name's Neil Kenny, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Inclusive and Special Education. I am programme chair of the Master of Education and Autism programme, a Level 9 programme for teachers working with autistic students, and I'm also research convener for our school. So before, I've been here since 2017. Before that, I was in the University of Limerick, working in initial teacher education down there.
Excellent. And previous to that, were you?
I have had a round robin of working in various different institutions. So I also had a certain time in Mary Immaculate College. I was in what is now TU Dublin, when it was the Institute of Technology in Blanchardstown, and I've taught programmes in early childhood education, primary, secondary, and social care for adults services. So a real mixed bag. And
Excellent.
before that, I would have worked in actual services in management and delivery as well.
Lovely. So just to get a sense of your background and how you came to be where you are today. Great. So what are you here to talk to us about today?
Obviously myself. No, I'm here to talk to you.
We're just going to get a monologue about Neil.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk about a paper that myself and a number of colleagues have recently gotten published, which we're delighted about, and then maybe also talk about a research network, which is linked to, they're on the same topic really, which is hoping to bring together people that already work together, or work kind of simultaneously alongside each other, but in separate silos. And the overarching issue is talking about inclusivity and collaborative research involving people from different backgrounds and with maybe different motivations or intentions.
Okay. So the focus is on the research?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit about how this came to be? What's the context? What's the background? How did you end up doing this publication?
Okay. I mostly do research looking at qualitative research methods, or inclusive education research, inquiry, and also then some commentary on policy. And so obviously a big part of that work had moved in more recent years to evaluation projects or research projects involving quite a diverse cohorts of participants. So young children, parents from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, English as second language, but also evaluations involving participant groups of individuals with different communication profiles, complex cognitive profiles, people with intellectual disability, people with a range of neurodevelopmental differences. That had been the direction research had been going in for the last number of years. Certainly some of my PhD students had been doing research involving data collections with autistic young people or those with intellectual disabilities. And what we were finding was that an awful lot of the work that they were doing preparing their research projects, or in where we're designing grant applications or project designs for funders, had been sourcing methods or how to adapt what we found to fit the profile of the people who were actually involved.
Okay.
So the paper that we published was drawing from that experience, and I suppose
the experience of taking research methods and adapting them to different audiences, that's the real driver of it?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's been a move in more recent years towards increasingly qualitative research methods being a component or a larger part of research in informing policy Our service design, big emphasis on including the voice or the perspectives of service end users or communities in policy or in services, which is laudable and it's right. Now that's not the case in all situations, but oftentimes what the emphasis in research methods on validity and reliability of methods had been leaning towards quote unquote doing it right or proper, or leaning heavily on existing models of data collection. So the paper we produced came from that experience, and we'd also myself and a colleague, Dr. Alison Doyle, who works in disability services in Trinity College and is the primary psychologist in Sarah's Education Services. Both of us had done a workshop on accessible research methods for researchers in the ESRI who were doing a national research project collecting data from cohorts or participants, they're adults I believe, with complex intellectual disabilities. So that was the impetus there, was to bring a lot of what we'd used or methods that were available, approaches to how we would have adapted them to design research projects, to put the workshop together, a set of materials for them. So following that, we decided that we would bring together the set of resources to plug a gap that we noted in the literature on how to design and adapt or differentiate research methods depending on the profile or the context of the people you're actually doing the research with.
So it's really a culmination of all this experience that you have.
Yeah.
And was it almost the workshop that made you realise we have plugged a gap? It feels like that from the way you described it.
No, I suppose sometimes, and I don't know if you would have the same experience, sometimes you're doing what you do and that you have them in your head and siloed in different areas, or it's advice you give to people and it's adapted depending on each circumstances. Whereas developing an all-day workshop is a lot of resources and there's a lot of collaboration, and to a degree then you have a map of a how-to in front of you there. So it felt that the some of the work anyway was done. So certainly it wasn't the start of things, but maybe it made the gap into putting the paper together
and
a little bit.
See it come together because you'd spent all that time working for the workshop.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So the paper is published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. It's published open access.
Excellent.
So I'm never
What's
sure.
the title of the paper?
It's called Transformative Inclusion, Differentiating Qualitative Research Methods to Support Participation from Individuals with Complex Communication and Cognitive Profiles. So it slips off the tongue, doesn't
Absolutely.
it? Yeah.
I think to make it easier, we'll have a link to that in the description of the podcast. And it's great that it's open access. Anybody listening will be able to read that. So I suppose then just moving on to the paper itself then rather than where it came from. You mentioned to me just on the way to this recording that it's a commentary on the use of methods for diverse set of learners. What way did you put that together, or what did you find is the wrong way of asking that question? No. But what were your conclusions, or what are you drawing out as part of your discussion in that paper?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's what to call it is not entirely clear, because we're not talking about new methods. We're not talking about pulling together something that's not already available. The problem that we found was that, one, the methods that are available are scattered to the wind in various different sub-domains or with particular populations, without it necessarily being applied across the board where there's a wider utility. And there is an issue with an overall framework to guide researchers in how to go about this. So the aim of it really was to talk about the implications, first of all, of the current situation. So the implications are that oftentimes individuals with complex communication and cognitive profiles was the title we gave. So individuals with, for example, sort of intellectual disabilities or complex neurodevelopmental conditions where they would have a kind of complex cognitive profile, or individuals who have complex or different communication profiles. So, for example, non-speaking autistic people, or selective mute individuals, or for example, those are just some examples. So oftentimes those individuals are not included in large-scale qualitative research methods.
Because there's nothing there to help the researchers actually engage with those individuals. Is that
Yes, it's either research shows that the methods and the technologies tend to be not as well known as, or they're relatively rare, or budgets are not sufficiently adapted to consider the longer time frame, higher budgetary costs, and larger coordination and flexibility that might be needed. So we use the concept of epistemological injustice, or whereby individuals' perspectives are not included, and particular voices are included within research, and others are excluded because
of this.
Exactly. So it goes towards why, for example, concepts or constructs such as autism have changed so much in recent years as more autistic researchers become involved, whereas previously non-autistic people were constructing understandings of the experience or the concept of autism.
Is one of the issues that you're trying to address that if somebody wants to carry out qualitative research with some neurodivergent population, they may have some qualitative tools, and every time every individual who encounters this has to take the qualitative tools and figure out themselves a way of adapting this to a different audience, and you're trying to bring together some previous experience and knowledge on how that was done, so that everybody doesn't have to relearn it. It's almost like a line in the sand. Look, this is what's gone before, a toolkit or a set of approaches.
So the sort of practice applied domain. So if you look at epistemic injustice, it actually is talking about how the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities needs to be enacted by actions and by accessible avenues to participate in research. So it would suggest that people need to be, society needs to foster inclusion and participation on people with intellectual disabilities. So to bring it back to what we're talking about, that means participating in research and being allowed to give their account of what they need and the way they see things in research that informs policy or service provision. So the approach we took was to use the principles of universal design for learning and apply these to the practice of research. So we would look at splitting it across how to plan for in advance and design accessible research that's appropriate for the participants you're working with. So these steps need to happen before you make any contact, and we go through some of the literature and best practice examples of the type of considerations that you need to put in place there for that. We looked at designing accessible research methods and approaches, and would walk through some of the considerations that are important with that and give examples of best practice available in the literature. And it'll be coming from, for example, literature on research with early childhood education with the under fives. Examples would be, for example, Clark and Moss's mosaic approach. It would be research methods with cross-cultural research, such as walking interviews or photo elicitation, but applying them to other participant populations. Or looking at the work of, for example, people like Craig Goodall in Northern Ireland, or researchers in the UK who would have used activity-based interview methods, so that rather than sitting down and going through an interview or a focus group, that you would involve active tasks and workshops that would involve people coming together and, for example, doing some drawing or using diamond ranking, so developing a set of resources and then ranking them in importance, or giving people tasks such as, for example, a walking interview, or things like one of Craig Goodall's would have had pots, And beans, where there's 3 pots. One is stuff I like, stuff I don't like, and then I don't know. And there's a set of statements, and you put it in particular pots, depending on your attitude. Then if it's that, you would talk about why you made those selections afterwards. If it was drawing, you would talk about what the drawing meant. If there were videos, pictures, you would explain why you took those pictures, and maybe then diamond rank them according to your preferences in schools, etc. So these kind of things.
It sounds like fascinating work, and I really like the transition from the literature, the policy, into practice. It'd be really valuable for practitioners, I think, exactly. to see, even as you speak about them there and you articulate it so well, the different strategies that they might employ and how that might be valuable in their context. I think it's really important work, and it shows, such development in your diversity and the diversity of participants that we should be including in research. It's great. So what's next? What would you like to do next? Is there anybody you'd like to collaborate with? Is there any resources that you would like to make available to people? What happens after the paper, apart from more papers?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I suppose a buzzword at the moment is universal design for learning in higher education, to make it accessible. But part of maybe what this paper was talking about is that research exploring inclusive education or inclusive social participation, oftentimes the machinery, the methods, the budgets, the timelines are not accessible. The available resources for people to design research using qualitative methods that includes non-speakers or people who required visual support or assistive communication. The actual technologies or the processes are less available than the hoped for values that they would talk about in their late review, for example. So some of that is also a feature of working as a researcher in the university. So how are universities and systems accessible and inclusive? And oftentimes they're not particularly. Do many of us work in research with the participant cohorts as researchers or as collaborators that we're writing papers about? Oftentimes that may be not as easy to do. So there's a whole schedule of research that myself and colleagues would be involved with at the moment, looking at accessible and collaborative research involving colleagues doing research in inclusive education, whether it's in primary, post-primary or further education and higher education, but also doing research alongside neurodivergent or researchers with disabilities. So we're developing a network which tentatively we're calling the ACORN network, which is accessible and collaborative research network. So there's a website just available at the moment, which lists the projects we're doing, and this involves a mix of researchers from different backgrounds, different universities, neurodivergent and non-neurodivergent researchers, and there's a whole series of research projects looking at, I suppose, not only inclusive objectives, or outcomes or ethos, but also an ethos of how we actually conduct the research, so that everybody's learning from each other. So there's 2 participatory research projects involving myself and my colleague Jane O'Kelly, in collaboration with Fiona Early, the Autism Friendly University Project Coordinator, and some autistic researchers looking at the experience of autistic students in higher education. And also we have data collected on autistic university staff. I collaborate with Dr. Teresa Shields at the University of Limerick on the experience of students with traumatic brain injury and navigating higher education, and how universities can be accessible to students with traumatic brain injury and neurodiversity in higher education.
And I'm sure, if anybody internationally or nationally is listening to this and is interested in that area, you're open to collaborations and looking at the application of some of these tools and methods that you talk about in the paper, the application of those in different contexts. I think it'd be really interesting to see how that how that maps out across, different populations. So
Absolutely.
there might be some interesting collaborations. And you mentioned a website there. We will put the link to that in the description also for people to consult and look at the projects and the resources that you've made available. So, Neil, unless there's anything else you want to add, is there any other burning ideas?
Much appreciated.
So thanks a million for joining me this month, Neil. I appreciate it. Just for our listeners, we are getting some works done in the university, and for the last 2 minutes there, I could hear some drilling faintly in the background. So if it comes through,
realism.
Yes, exactly. So apologies if that does interfere with the listening experience. So again, thanks very much, Neil, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Take care.
Much appreciated.
Thanks again for joining us on Let's Talk Education Research. To find out more about the podcast, you can email me directly on peter.d.tiernan@dcu.ie, or you can find me on Twitter at pt_phone_home.